Who do you think is more prone to heart disease? A middle-aged man from our hunter-gatherer population in the Amazon, with infrequent access to healthcare and near constant exposure to parasites and viruses? Or a middle-aged American who runs marathons and has pretty good health insurance? If you guessed the hunter-gatherer, well, don't be too proud of yourself because I definitely set it up that way. But we often assume that access to gyms, doctors, and a shelf full of supplements makes us healthier than people living traditional lifestyles. But when it comes to the chronic diseases of aging, like obesity, heart disease, and dementia, the evidence tells a different story. So take me, the middle-aged marathoner in this scenario. Hold for applause. Even with all my hard-fought, above-average cardiovascular fitness, I'm still at greater risk for heart disease than my counterpart in the Amazon. But why is that? Today's guest is trying to figure it out. Welcome to Lab Coat Optional from Arizona State University, the show where advanced research meets everyday curiosity. I'm your host, Pete Zaroka, and each week we dive into the latest research shaping our world. Minus the jargon, and definitely minus the lab coat. This episode, we're joined by Ben Trumble, a professor of anthropology in the School of Human Evolution and Social Change. He's also a researcher in the Center for Evolution and Medicine and the Institute of Human Origins at ASU. Ben's a human biologist who works in collaboration with the Tsimane people, a remote hunter-gatherer population in Bolivia, who have the lowest rates of dementia and the healthiest hearts compared to those living in industrialized nations. Ben's research group has a long-standing relationship with the Tsimane to collect demographic and biomedical data to learn how ecology and evolution shape human health and aging. This relationship has been in effect for more than 20 years. In exchange for their research participation, the Tsimane receive medical care and social services. And these benefits extend to the entire community, not just those involved in research. So stick around to learn how Ben's research is winding back the clock to learn how our brains and bodies aged before the Industrial Revolution and what the Tsimane can teach us about combating the chronic diseases of aging. Ben, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
So I wanted to start talking about the Tsimane, which is one such population that you work with to kind of understand what health was like before, like the Industrial Revolution, basically, right? Mm-hmm. So everyone listening has a good mental picture of these people. Describe them to me. What is their lifestyle, culture, and environment like?
So the Tsimane live in lowland Bolivia. A lot of people think of Bolivia as like mountains. Mm-hmm. And sure, there are a bunch of mountains in the highlands. Yeah. But this is the lowlands. So it's basically like sea level and basically flat rainforest forever. And so lots of rivers. These rivers are the headwaters of the Amazon. So they eventually, all these rivers come together and become the Amazon River. Mm-hmm. The people that live there, there are several different groups, but the group that I work the most with are the Tsimane. And they're forager horticulturalists, which means that they're basically hunter farmers.
Okay.
So they go out and they'll clear a small area of the forest. So these are big trees. Like some of them are, like 30 feet in diameter. And they'll go out there and chop them down. And then after they're chopped down, they'll burn them. And that releases all the carbon and the nitrogen in those trees because there's almost no topsoil in the Amazon. So it's really hard for most crops to grow. So what they do is they cut down all these trees, they burn them, release all those nutrients into the soil, and then they'll plant things like manioc, plantains, corn, and now rice more recently.
And what's manioc?
Manioc's, it's like a tuber, so it's like a potato.
Okay.
They grow underground, but you can't eat them right away. You have to cook them first. Otherwise, they aren't really edible.
Okay.
And so they'll also go hunting. And so they go out hunting, they hunt for primates, for peccary, they're sort of like these pig creatures.
Sure.
Tapir, all sorts of forest animals. Basically anything that they can catch, they'll eat. Mm-hmm. And then they'll also fish. And there are all sorts of different fish in the river.
And how do they hunt? Or do they have firearms? Or?
So these days they do.
Okay.
They used to be bows.
Right.
But during my dissertation work, I followed a bunch of hunters. I would collect saliva samples and look at changes in testosterone while they were hunting. And there, most of the guys had 22s. And if they had a shotgun, what they would do is they'd cut the top of the shotgun shell off, they'd dump out the shot, and they put a rock in there, and they'd turn it into a slug. Oh. And then they'd tie it back up with fishing line. A little bit shady in terms of firearm safety.
Oh, really shady.
But it's effective if you want to take down a deer.
Yeah.
And a 22 isn't going to be enough.
Yeah.
And especially for tapir, they're really big. They're like the size of a cow. And so something like that would take a lot of hits.
Sure.
With a 22.
And not be great for the animal.
No.
Yeah.
And so, but you know, when you're hunting, you really need to get that meat. Otherwise, you aren't going to be able to feed your family.
Yep. So when you talk about the Tsimane, we're not talking about a singular village.
No. So it's about 95 communities.
Okay.
Spread over maybe a couple hundred miles.
What are the setup of the villages like?
So the Tsimane, until very recently, the standard Tsimane house was basically just 4 posts and then a thatch roof.
Okay.
And kind of open walls.
Sure.
And then they'd usually make kind of like a raised platform that was the bed. The family would all sleep together there on the bed. And then there'd usually be a fire near that. And that's where they do all their cooking.
Okay.
And so open walls, not a lot of privacy. You'd be separated from your neighbors. And so maybe it'd be a 5 to 10 minute walk between each of the families.
Oh, okay.
But then what you do is the average Tsimane woman has about 9 kids. So it's a really high fertility population.
Yeah.
And so what they'll typically do is that, you know, as their kids grow up and get a little bit older, maybe the one of the daughters, you know, finds a husband. And so then they'll build another house maybe 2 minutes away. And so then you kind of get these family clusters where over time you end up with, you know, a cluster that's all related family members.
Yeah.
All pretty close together, but a little bit further apart.
It's like multi-generational compound.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
And then it makes food sharing really easy.
Yeah.
Because one of the things with hunting as a strategy to get meat, you aren't always successful. The average Tsimane hunt is about 8.5 hours, covers like a little over 11 miles, and there's only about a 60% chance of success. So that'd be like me walking 5.5 miles to the grocery store just to find out they're out of meat and then having to walk home. And so what that means, though, is that if a bunch of you are all working together and kind of pooling, and so, you know, like maybe I'm not successful hunting today, but if you're my brother-in-law and you are, then all we need is meat for that day. And it's not like we can save it for very long because there's no refrigeration.
Yeah.
And so when there's meat, you got to eat it. And so, you know, it makes sharing a lot easier.
One question I had was how integrated are they with like Bolivia overall?
So not very. It used to be until probably about 10 or 15 years ago that they were really not integrated at all because very, very few Tsimane speak Spanish. So they speak their own language, Tsimane, which is a language isolate. And so it's just the Tsimane and one other population that speak that language. Nobody else speaks it. So they can't really communicate very well in town. And so they get treated like second-class citizens. And so when I was in Bolivia, long story about I had to buy a cow. And so buying this cow.
Wait, you had to buy a cow?
Yeah,
okay.
Which they don't teach you how to do in grad school. That's one of those things they don't really train you for.
No, I've never bought a cow either, so.
But I was setting up a giant soccer tournament, and I was going to look at acute changes in testosterone and cortisol and other hormones during the soccer tournament.
Okay.
Stuff that had been done in the U.S., but had never been done in a population like this. But I wanted to make it kind of a big event and get a bunch of people together. And when I talked to a bunch of the people, a bunch of the Tsimane, they were like, well, you know, like, have a bunch of food and everybody will show up. And so I went into town to buy a cow, and I got quoted this exorbitant price. And I was like, geez, that seems like I'm getting ripped off. That's the gringo price.
Yeah.
And so I went and talked to one of the Tsimane guys that I work with, and he went, and they charged him twice as much. And so he didn't buy it.
Whoa.
And I ended up getting a random taxi driver and convinced him to buy it for me so that I could get a reasonable price.
Yeah.
But they knew they could rip off the Tsimane because Tsimane don't have cows.
Sure.
And they don't know how much a cow costs.
Yeah.
So they get treated like kind of like second-class citizens in many ways.
Okay.
And so people used to not like to go to town. But starting about 10 or 15 years ago, because of some changes in local politics, the Tsimane started to get ID cards and started to be able to vote. And that started to change things. And so now there are a lot of schools in all the communities that are nearest to town. Basically, like if you're within about 10 miles of town, then those communities all got a school. And so those children are starting to learn Spanish now. And so there's more and more Spanish speaking among the Tsimane. But when I first started working there in 2010, especially the older folks. Most of my research is on people over the age of 60.
Yeah.
And it's incredibly rare for them to speak really any Spanish. But now a lot of the younger folks are speaking Spanish.
So do you know Tsimane?
I can talk about anything related to health, anything related to hunting, the weather.
Okay.
But I couldn't talk about hopes and dreams.
Okay, interesting. Well, I mean, that's the stuff that's most relevant to your work, I suppose.
Yeah.
But speaking of the language, you mentioned it was a language isolate?
Yeah. So it basically, there aren't any other languages that are like this. There's one other group called the Moseten, who we also work with. And the Moseten and the Tsimane were the same population until about 300 years ago. 300 years ago, a group of Jesuit missionaries moved into the area, and the Moseten stayed and became the Moseten. And the Tsimane, they voted with their feet and just went deeper into the jungle.
Oh.
And so the Moseten now, they have running water, they have electricity, they buy their food at the grocery store, they have Facebook pages. And so they're a very interesting comparative group because they're the same genetically.
Yeah.
They were genetically identical until 300 years ago, but now they live a completely different lifestyle. So a lot of my work is on heart disease or on Alzheimer's. And we look at that in the Tsimane, and we found that they had the lowest levels of cardiovascular disease ever recorded. So then we started working with the Moseten because, what if it's genetic? So if it was genetic, then the Moseten should also be super protected against cardiovascular disease. But if there's some part of heart disease that's related to, say, lifestyle, then the Moseten are going to be really interesting to work with because they're kind of intermediate between the Tsimane and the U.S., where they're still doing a lot of heavy physical activity, but they're living in standard homes and they're drinking bottled water, and so it's a very different lifestyle.
Yeah.
And turns out they're about halfway to Americans in terms of cardiovascular disease.
Which is to say, not great.
Not great.
Yeah.
But it also suggests that it isn't that the Tsimane have some special gene that's protecting them from cardiovascular disease, that it's that lifestyle plays an important role.
So they have much lower rates of heart disease and other conditions as well?
So a lot of my work is focused on chronic diseases of aging.
Okay.
So things like heart disease, Alzheimer's, but that's not to say that Tsimane don't experience ill health. So it used to be that 20 to 40% of infants died. Infant mortality has dropped quite a bit over the last several decades, but it's still quite high. About 50% of adults have a respiratory infection at any time. About 75% of adults have intestinal parasites at any given time. So it's not that they're super healthy. They're living in an area where they don't have clean water. They don't have toilets, and so there's a lot of diseases that spread.
Yeah, it's in the jungle too.
Yeah, but one of the things that they don't really have are very many of these chronic diseases of aging that we think of as kind of normal.
Right. So what level of access do they have to modern healthcare?
So now they have a little bit more access.
Okay.
But in the past, so what would happen would be, if I was an older Tsimane guy and I got sick, I would, try to first see if I could get better by using some herbs or some local remedies. I might see a curandero, sort of like an individual that has more healing knowledge in that community.
Okay. And
then I kind of wait to the last minute. And then at the last minute, if everything else had failed and I was clearly really doing really poorly, I go to the hospital. And then at the hospital, because I didn't speak Spanish, they would sort of be like, a pediatrician, where they just poke until they found something that hurt. And then they would probably just hang an IV bag and maybe give some kind of a drug. And unfortunately, about 20 years ago, some well-meaning NGO came through and they wanted to treat leishmaniasis. It's a flesh-eating protozoa.
Okay.
A sandfly bites you, and then it basically creates, it looks like a cigar burn.
Yeah.
And for most people, if it's on just your skin, then it's going to be okay, and it'll eventually heal on its own. If it gets into your, on your nose and gets into cartilage, it'll eat through your nose and then down the back of your throat, and it's a pretty horrible way to die. But this well-meaning NGO came through, and they wanted to treat a bunch of people because they knew how common it was in the region. And they had the old treatment. And the old treatment, it's an IV treatment, and it burns out your vein completely, so you have to use a different vein every time. Causes fever-like seizures. It's really unpleasant. Your hair falls out. When I got it, I used the new treatment, and they had to put a PICC line into my heart to drop the drugs there because it's still so toxic. And that's the new US treatment.
Oh.
And so the treatment that they were getting was really horrible.
Yeah.
And then that led to, after 4 or 5 days, almost everybody who was getting this treatment stopped taking the treatment. And then they came back and told everybody in their villages about how these people in lab coats came in and
Tortured them?
Tortured them, yeah. Like they hung these bags of venom.
Oh.
So
yeah.
Then what was happening was patients would go to the hospital and the doctors can't really communicate with the patients. They can't get a good medical history and say like, 7 days of abdominal pain, or you've had a fever for 3 days or whatever the condition was. So the first thing they do is, hang an IV bag and give them some drugs. And if that patient comes in, they're already septic and they die, the family's like, yeah, I took them to the hospital and they just hung a bag of venom. And that made them less likely to want to go to the hospital.
Yeah.
And so what we did was we started having one of our translators work at the hospital. And so our translator then could help translate for the patients and translate into Spanish. And then the doctors could actually treat people. And then we could collect data on, what the health conditions of these individuals were. So we could collect some really interesting data, but we could also provide a service that was really needed.
You've been to Bolivia many times, it sounds like. How do you actually get to these villages? Are you taking a boat? You also mentioned a mobile medical lab. Is that on a boat? Is it on a Jeep? Are you packing it in? Like, how does that work?
So from here, I fly to Miami, and then I fly from Miami. It used to be that I fly from Miami to La Paz, and then from La Paz, I get on a bus and take the road of death down the Andes.
That sounds fun.
Yeah, it's called that for a reason. And then you get down into the lowlands. It'd be like a 20-hour bus ride or 30-hour bus ride, and you get to San Borja eventually. And then in San Borja, we go down to the river, and we'd get in our boat. Our project has a boat, and we would go, depending on where the communities are, there's some that are within an hour of town, and there's some that are 6 days upriver. And then we get there, and we have a big team. So we've got a doctor, we have a biochemist, we have a number of Tsimane anthropologists. So Tsimane who speak Spanish, but then who are trained in specific interviews. So like, people are doing demographic interviews, like how many children did you have? Like when were they born? That sort of stuff. Because we have to figure out what people's ages are. It's not something that's like a simple process. It's a very complicated process to figure out how old somebody is who is in their 80s. But, there are certain events like there was a giant storm in the 1930s and the river turned blue when some mining company dumped a bunch of chemicals in it for, 1 year. So like, were you alive when that happened? Do you remember your parents talking about that? And then once we can figure out a key event that we can age a particular individual, then we can start to say like, are you older or younger than this person in your community? Are you older than younger than this person? It's
like triangulating their age.
Yep.
Wow.
And then there's one Tsimane community that has a mission, like a Jesuit mission. And so they've been keeping records since the 1960s or 70s. And so what we were able to do is use our same methods there, but then we were able to look in their actual like communion and baptism records, and we were able to cross-check everybody. And we found out that we were actually very, very accurate.
Is that fun or is that frustrating?
It's part of the job.
Okay,
if we're going to be talking about aging, we have to make sure that our ages are correct.
Yeah.
That's like the critical thing.
Okay.
And it takes a massive amount of work. This is a huge team project. It was started by Mike Gervin and Hilly Kaplan, and then now co-directed by the two of them, as well as John Stieglitz and myself. I kind of run the lab side of things. So what we do is we get to this community, and we now have, it takes about 2 or 3 boats, to be honest, because we have a team of about 10 of these Tsimane anthropologists. They each have a different interview that they're working on. And we set up, we do a community meeting. We've been working there since 2002, so the Tsimane know us, and they know what we're working on, and they know how the project works. But we do a community meeting, and we talk about, here are the studies we're doing this year. And then we set up everybody for an appointment. And so older folks, right now we're working mostly with Alzheimer's, so people over the age of 60, we have it set up so they'll come in for a morning fasting blood draw. And so they come in at 6 a.m. and we have a full wet lab set up. So we have solar panels, we have electric generators, all brought in on a canoe, and we set up a big medical consultorio. We set up a big lab space. They come in, they do a fasting morning blood draw, and then we have a cook who makes them breakfast. So they sit and eat breakfast, and then the biochemist does what's called does a complete blood count, checks their white blood cells, does a urinalysis, does a fecal smear, does a full lab work, and passes that off to the doctor. And then patients go and see the doctor, and then when they sit down with the doctor has the full lab workup. I get great medical care here in the U.S., but if I have a sore throat and I go to the doctor, they're like, oh, yeah, you got a sore throat. Here's some amoxicillin. And here what we can do is our doctor looks at their white blood cell count and says, oh, yeah, your white blood cell count's elevated and you got a sore throat. That seems bacterial or that seems viral based on like your white blood cell counts and how they look. So we can provide some really high quality medical care, even in the middle of the Amazon. And then we have liquid nitrogen tanks, and we have battery powered coolers and all sorts of stuff to collect samples. And some of that we run in Bolivia. So we have Bolivian biochemists in Santa Cruz and Cochabamba, and they will run lipids. So they'll look at like levels of cholesterol. But then some things we can't do there. And so we work with the Bolivian government, export samples to here. And then here I have a big lab where we run additional samples there, looking at very special biochemical analyses that we can't do in the field.
So, okay, interesting. So getting back to diseases that you look at in aging, right? What separates the Tsimane from industrialized populations or even the Moseten? Like what makes them different in terms of the prevalence of these diseases?
So like if you think of something like cardiovascular disease,
okay,
that's the number one cause of death in the U.S. About 25% of all ER visits in the U.S. are cardiovascular disease related.
Okay.
And so we wanted to see, is that going to be the same for this population or not? And we know that there are modifiable risk factors. So things like diet and exercise. So first we looked at diet in the Tsimane. And so, Tsimane aren't on the Atkins diet. They're getting about 16% of their calories from protein.
Okay.
That's the exact same as in the U.S. But they're getting about 72% of their calories from carbohydrates. So it's a very high carbohydrate diet. Whereas in the U.S., it's about 50% of our diet is from carbohydrates. The kind of big difference between the Tsimane and the U.S. is that we get a lot more fat in our diets and a lot more saturated fat than they do. So we thought, okay, maybe diet will mean that they have lower levels of cardiovascular disease. And then we looked at physical activity. So I work with a bunch of cardiologists, and they tell their patients they should get 10,000 steps per day. Fortunately, the average American only gets about 5,100 steps per day. The average Tsimane gets about 16,000, 17,000 steps per day.
Okay.
So that means that by the time a Tsimane guy is 84, he's walked the distance from the Earth to the moon. By the time he's in his 70s, he's walked the circumference of the Earth like 7 times.
Okay.
So a lot more physically active than we are.
Yeah.
But then we talked to these cardiologists, and they were like, well, we have vegan marathon runners, and they get cardiovascular disease.
Yeah.
And so we worked with these cardiologists, and we said, well, look, they got great blood pressure, and they got low cholesterol in this population. They probably don't have heart disease. And they're like, no, those are all risk factors, but that's not cardiovascular disease. You need to actually look at cardiovascular disease. So, okay, well, how do we do that? They said, you just use a CT scanner. And you can do a CT scan of the heart, a gated coronary CT scan. You can tell if there's calcium in the heart, they have heart disease. If there's not, they don't have heart disease. And what we found was that the Tsimane have the lowest levels of cardiovascular disease of any population on the planet.
Any
population.
Okay.
Every population that's ever been looked at, they have the lowest levels.
Okay.
So in the U.S., about 85% of people who are over the age of 40 have some level of calcium in their hearts. And if you have any calcium in your heart, that's heart disease. And so that doesn't mean you're going to have a heart attack tomorrow. You could have 1 unit of calcium, and that's still cardiovascular disease. But if you have really high levels of calcium in your heart, then you should be seeing a cardiologist, every 6 months or every year. And so in the Tsimane, only 15% had any calcium in their heart, but very few had more than a few units of calcium. And so 85% were completely clean.
And what age of people are we looking at? We're talking about 60 plus?
This is about age 45 plus.
45 plus, okay.
But then we went through, and for every Tsimane who's ever passed away, we talked to their family members and did what's called a verbal autopsy. Because we wanted to make sure. So if I have a heart attack and an ambulance gets called and I get to the hospital and they get me to the catheter lab, they might be able to save me.
Yeah.
But if Tsimane has a heart attack in the jungle, then they could die, and then they would never make it into our study.
Yeah.
So we went through and we did these autopsies, these verbal autopsies with the family members of everyone who died in the population. And we didn't really see much evidence that there had been heart attacks. We also looked at, you can do these ultrasounds of the heart, and they can show if there's damage to some of the muscle. And if there's damage to the muscle, then that suggests that you had a minor heart attack before.
Right.
And we didn't see any evidence of that.
Weird.
And so these people just have incredibly healthy hearts. And
so the big question is why?
Well, so taking a step back to get at the really big answer that you really want.
Yeah.
We study health in this really weird environment that we built for ourselves. If I want meat for dinner, I can get my car I can drive to a fast food restaurant, hunt and gather 2,000 calories. I don't even have to step out of my car. In fact,
Hunt and gather.
yeah, there's probably an app for that.
Yeah,
and they'll probably
yeah.
just deliver it right to my house.
Hunter.
And
Just
yeah.
an R. No, you are. Yeah.
And so, we live in a very different environment than most of human evolution. You took the last 5 million years of human evolution and you compressed that into a single calendar year. We would have been hunter-gatherers on January 1st, hunter-gatherers on February 1st, March, April, May, June. December 31st at 11:40 p.m., that's when the Industrial Revolution would have occurred.
Oh, okay.
And so what we think of as normal is
Yeah.
this tiny little blip of human history where we've created these bizarro environments. And now, honestly, like the default would be to put on weight.
Yeah.
Just because we have access to essentially infinite calories.
Yeah.
We don't have to get physical activity. We have all sorts of medications if we get sick. And so working with a population like the Tsimane, we can kind of understand what health was like under normal conditions. Because we're operating outside of the manufacturer's recommended warranty right now. And so by working with a population like the Tsimane, we can say like, what was health actually like in the past? Basically, what's the baseline of human health?
Yeah.
And then if we see differences for the baseline of human health for a population like the Tsimane to us, then we can start to say, okay, what are the differences in these populations? Like, what is it about lifestyle? What is it about physical activity? What is it about diet? What is it about the immune system?
Yeah.
We actually think the immune system plays a really important role in cardiovascular disease.
How so?
So for you or I, about 10% of our white blood cells are this one specific subtype called a monocyte.
Monocytes.
Monocytes are hall monitors.
Okay.
They're just looking for anything out of place. And so if they happen to see cholesterol passing through the wall of an artery, because cholesterol can do that, they'll grab it and they'll start to calcify it. That's their job. For us, 10% of our white blood cells are monocytes. For the Tsimane, less than 1% of their white blood cells are monocytes.
Okay.
And that's because as soon as they produce them, they immediately go and fight something real because they have real illnesses and, real parasites and pathogens that they're fighting off. And so they have almost none of these circulating. And then on top of that, because of their diet and their exercise, they have these low lipid levels. And so it creates a kind of a perfect environment where because they don't have that much cholesterol and because they don't have that many of these monocytes, they aren't going to be calcifying in their hearts the same way.
So we have an abundance of like overzealous board hall monitors, and they are understaffed and stretched thin and working in an environment where they need to tackle real stuff.
Exactly.
What is the real stuff that they're tackling?
So they have hookworm.
Okay.
They have other intestinal parasites. They have all sorts of respiratory infections, gastrointestinal infections, giardia.
Okay.
And I just want to make clear, I'm not recommending that people in the U.S. go out and get all these.
Yeah,
and trust me, I've caught all the parasites like Pokemon.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. It's deeply unpleasant.
Uh-huh.
Not what I would recommend. But what I would recommend in the future, and this isn't my research, but in the future, if what we could do, if we could trick the immune system into thinking that it has a problem. So, people shouldn't go out and get hookworm. But if we could trick the body's immune system into thinking we had hookworm, so if we could take the cells that are on the surface of a hookworm and we could turn that into a pill and give that to somebody, that person's immune system would be like, oh, shoot, there's a hookworm in here. And it would, start changing the types of cells that it was creating. And there have been some studies that have tried this in certain other populations. We don't do any clinical trials, but the people who've done clinical trials in other populations have shown that you can reduce autoimmune disorders and other things, because the autoimmune disorders, most of those are because of these overzealous hall monitors. They start attacking your pancreas, and then you get type 1 diabetes.
Or eczema?
Eczema.
Allergies
Yep,
in general,
allergies
right?
in general. That's an overzealous immune response.
Yeah.
And it's because we live in this bizarre environment where we got rid of all of those pathogens. And I'm, again, not saying we should bring those back.
Right.
But if we could find a way to trick our immune system into thinking that they're still around, then we could shift our immune function in a way that we could prevent some of these autoimmune disorders. We could maybe slow down some aspects of cardiovascular disease.
Give the hall monitor something to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Give them a fake job. Yeah. And then they're happy. We're happy.
Yeah.
Everyone wins.
That's so interesting. Like, tricking your immune system to work on fake problems so they're not working on what they think is a real problem, which is actually detrimental to your body. Do you feel some sort of time pressure around studying the Tsimane because their lifestyle is changing? Does that kind of impose a bit of a time pressure on you and other researchers to kind of answer these problems before they can't be answered anymore.
Absolutely. And so really this is our last chance, and every population on the planet is undergoing this greater level of industrialization. And so, the Hadza in Tanzania, a group of hunter-gatherers that a lot of other researchers have worked with, they're undergoing massive changes in everything from their society to the way that they hunt to where they're living. And so really this is the last chance to be able to examine something like this.
Interesting.
Wow. But at the same time, it's still really interesting because the changes don't come at the same time for every single person.
Yeah.
So the older folks who are over the age of 60, they're not going to go out and learn Spanish tomorrow. And, they're going to keep living these traditional lifestyles. The people who are further away from town, they're living a different lifestyle than the people who are living much closer to town, or the people that they're now, I think, 300 Tsimane that have moved into town. And so, what we can do is we can look at these different cohorts, these groups that are living in town versus the groups that are still living traditionally, the groups that are speaking Spanish and doing wage labor now versus the groups that are still hunting and fishing for every bit of their food. And so we can use that as kind of a natural experiment to say, what is it about lifestyle? What is it about access to medication? What is it about, physical activity? What is it about diet? And we can start to break down, what are the key factors that we could modify in the US or in Europe or other populations to better help with human health.
I was kind of wondering, just in general, what hopes do you have for the future of this work?
So one of the things that I really want to understand, so when you go to the doctor and they do a blood test, they look at your values and they say, this is the normal range for all these different values. But what if it's not? What if that's the normal range for people who are living in this bizarre world that we've created for ourselves with roads and access to as many calories as we want? If we could figure out what health was like in the past, and we could figure out what was the baseline, what things were good, what things weren't good, and if we could create a more optimized version of human health, looking to the past. So natural selection has solved a whole bunch of problems. And, my students aren't allowed to plagiarize, but we can plagiarize from natural selection. No problem there.
Yeah.
And so if we could figure out ways that natural selection's already figured these things out, and then we could figure out how it's done it, and if it's a specific gene that produces a specific protein, maybe we can give people shots that contain 10 times more of that protein. If it's a specific gene that lowers a protein, maybe we can find a way to prevent that protein from being produced.
Yeah.
And then with that, we can kind of figure out, okay, what is the potential for human health? And then we can kind of, my goal would be that we can eventually move back the aging process and we can be healthier for longer. There's going to be a life expectancy for everybody.
Yeah.
But if we can push that back a little bit further, that's kind of my goal.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Ben. This was super interesting.
Thanks so much for having me.
Learning about what you've learned about the Tsimane and what we can learn from them, I think is such a fascinating thing. And most people are not going to go to the lowlands of Bolivia. So learning what people know there and bringing it back here is just so cool. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning into Lab Coat Optional. We are a production of the Strategic Marketing Communications team at Arizona State University's Knowledge Enterprise. Knowledge Enterprise is led by Executive Vice President Sally C. Morton. If you enjoyed the show, leave us a review on the podcast app of your choice. And if you found us on YouTube, please like and subscribe. We are at the mercy of the mighty, fickle algorithms, and stuff like that helps people find the show. As always, lab coats are optional on this show, but we want to keep our researchers safe in the lab. So wear your PPE. Until next time, stay curious.